Hello everybody, this is Cynical Apex Commentaries here today with another video. This one's going to be a little different to my usual commentary oriented videos, as this is actually going to be more of a top 10 list, or more so a way of you actually getting to know me a little better, well, at least my personal taste in movies. You guessed it, this is my top 10 favorite movies of all time. Before we begin, yes, this is obviously going to be 100% subjective and not meant to be a definitive guide on what the best movies of all time are, just what my personal favorites are for various reasons, which I will go into as we discuss this further along. Okay, so let's now begin this video, shall we? Starting with the number 10 slot, which goes to Jurassic World, the 2015 installment in the Jurassic Park series. A film that got a 91.3 out of 100 rating from me, and a film that I actually really enjoyed. For full disclosure, I am actually not the biggest fan of the Jurassic Park series. I felt like the initial installments in the series were just bland at points and really weren't able to hook me in and actually engage me within them, which is why they got lower ratings. Like, I was expecting this film to be sort of in that hovering around the 71, 72 range like the other films were. However, from the opening scenes of the film, I was hooked. I was immersed within it, and it actually managed to keep me hooked in from the start to the finish. Something that, a film that, although in a genre that I'm actually sort of a fan of, which is science fiction and the whole concept of dinosaurs and how they actually get kept in a park or captivity, whilst, as we all know, how they were more used to the wild and sort of how they would hunt in packs and how their handlers would actually control that element. It's always interested me and sort of caused me to gravitate towards that sort of film. But I feel like they actually did it right here. I feel like they hit on the notes that they needed to. They sort of got a message across about how you treat animals or how you treat things that are naturally wild when you actually bring them into a captivity oriented environment, and how when you isolate animals like they did with the main dinosaur here, the Idonopsis Rex, or however you want to pronounce it, they kept it away from siblings and stuff like that, and it just went out of control and into sort of a frenzy, so to speak. The casting was really well done in this too, and I feel like each member of the cast played their role with aplomb and to perfection, whilst managing to give you a gravitational, engaging story that made you want to keep going back and watching it even after the end credits had rolled and the film had concluded. The number 9 film on my list, which also got a 91.3 out of 100 rating from me, but is slightly above Jurassic World simply due to factors that I will explain more as we discuss it, is Taken. The original Taken, that is, which was released in 2008. You see, I'm actually not the biggest Liam Neeson fan, not because of recent controversies, but because I felt like his acting style was sort of bland and only pigeonholed for a couple of roles. However, the role that he filled in Taken was perfect for him. It was the ideal casting choice for a role that needed intensity and wanted to generate sympathy towards him at the same time, as he was a retired CIA agent that ultimately wanted to connect more with his daughter, who got kidnapped in the story. Bit of a spoiler there. However, it hooked you in and it engaged you. It had the right dosage of action and story elements to it, which made you actually want to be interested and invested within the action scene. Something I feel like a lot of action flicks actually miss when you look at them. You realize that they focus either solely on the action, or when they do the story, it sort of feels like it's shoehorned in rather than being natural. Whilst with Taken, it was 100% natural. It was done in a sense where you knew what you wanted from it. You knew exactly what it was going to give you, ultimately. And it gave you just that. It gave you an engaging film. It gave you a film that was well cast, well directed, and the cinematics behind it were perfectly complementary to the story as well. That for me was the deciding factor on why I have this at number 9 and Jurassic World at number 10 and not the other way around, despite them getting the same rating. It was the whole cinematics and how everything actually ultimately meshed together. Yes, there were flaws with the film in that sometimes it did feel a little flat, but it was only very, very slight in my opinion. And ultimately that wasn't enough for me to actually mark it down or knock it into the number 10 slot. Number 8 on my list is the eloquent yet still amazingly engaging Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, released in 2011, and easily my favorite in the Mission Impossible series. I'm actually a Mission Impossible fan. I've always loved the sort of blend of action and thriller that they managed to combine in the movies and how they actually execute it well. It's one of those boom or bust sort of movies where it relies sort of on the eye candy to an extent, which is like the gadgets and the action sequences. However, it ties in a thrilling story that keeps you hooked and makes you want to see a satisfying conclusion to it, which is what it more often than not will give you. It gives you a conclusion that actually ties everything up nicely and doesn't fall flat like a lot of other films do. Now, you might think that that's similar to what I said about Taken, and it is. However, the 91.5 out of 100 rating should show you that it does it slightly better, executes it slightly more fluidly, at least in my opinion, and doesn't have the flat parts of it that Taken did. Mission Impossible as a series has always been one of those series that to me will always get a rating of at least 75 out of 100. But Ghost Protocol stands out from that. It takes a step up, and Rogue Nation, which is the sequel to this, or the follow-up film in the series, is actually fine. It's solid. However, it does not quite hit on the marks that Mission Impossible did, which is basically popcorn-style movie done right, and an absolute boom in the boom or bust philosophy that I had briefly discussed before when it comes to films like this. Number 7 on my list is Finding Nemo, released in 2003. Yes, a movie that is oriented towards kids finds its way on my top 10 list. Now, honestly, I'm going to be real with you. This should not be seen as just another kid-style Disney movie. Because whilst, yes, that's what it is at its core, it is more so a movie for all ages, and something that you can easily enjoy whether or not you are a kid or an adult. Yes, it may not have the engaging story elements that other films on this list do, and it may not have sort of the action that other films like this do. However, it has a story that hooks you in and actually makes you feel sympathetic towards Nemo and wants you to give it a satisfying or gratifying conclusion. You want to see Nemo safe. You want to see him reunite with his family, which he does. And that in its own right is something that gets you engaged and enjoyed and makes you feel a myriad of emotions as you go through the film. Something that at its core I've always felt like films should do. The cinematics are fantastic in it too. The voicing, although at times can feel a little bit is fine, is actually solid for what it's meant to do. The 91.9 rating for me was actually done upon its first watching. However, when I went back and rewatched it a couple of years ago, I felt that it would stay the same regardless of me having grown up. and the movie no longer being in my sort of demographic. As I said, it was initially meant to be a kid's film by Disney. However, again, it's a film that I feel like people of all ages can enjoy and really immerse themselves in for a fun family film night. Number 6 is The Dark Knight Rises, or the final film in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, released in 2012 and got a rating of 93.2 out of 100 from me. This film is dark, it is gritty, it is brooding. It has a really good villain in it in Bane. I actually enjoyed that sort of villain, even though, yes, the musclehead style of villain doesn't actually translate well in movies and they don't really give it the right depth. Bane actually has that depth. He has that sort of motivation, and when he actually takes over Gotham and makes his speech, you feel it. You can actually resonate with it to a certain extent, which is something I always look for in a well-written and well-crafted villain, which it is done well here, as obviously you can see. Christopher Nolan is an absolute genius when it comes to the writing of the series. Batman Begins, which is the weakest film and the first film in the trilogy, was actually still solid and did get an 84 out of 100 from me. Now, I know that's irrelevant here and we're meant to be talking about The Dark Knight Rises, but the concepts that have been born in that, as well as The Dark Knight, which we'll get to later, spoilers as to one of the actual top 5, which this film could have easily been if there were just a few different elements to it. It is thought-provoking, and I know some thought there was some political messaging behind it, which there wasn't. It was a film intended to make you think. It was a film intended to enhance the Batman series, and it does that perfectly. Batman is one of those thought-provoking superheroes who is more of a vigilante, and I don't know if you can necessarily call him a true superhero in the sense of what most people would correlate with a superhero. However, he is, and to me, that is why he's actually my favorite sort of comic hero or superhero of all time. And Bane is probably my third favorite villain in the series. And yes, we have an appearance from Liam Neeson in this as Ra's al Ghul. Now, he actually suits this role fine, as he did with Taken. However, as I said, I'm not his biggest fan. And by the way, Christian Bale is the best Batman in my opinion. He does it absolutely perfectly and catches all the nuances that you would expect from a Batman. However, there are some elements that just kept us out of the top 5, and that was the fact that although the sequel to the series, and it wraps up the series nicely, I felt like it just fell short of a couple of things I was expecting. But again, I'll get to that a little later on. Again, this is spoilers when I discuss The Dark Knight, which, yes, is in my top 5. And I feel like the execution of this film just didn't quite match that standard, which personally could actually be more that I had the standards a little too high for it to begin with, which could be true, but that's just how it is when you get a great series where the worst film in the trilogy is still good enough to be a top 25 to 30 film of all time, in my opinion at least. You'll get those sort of standards where you've already got a lofty bar and just matching that bar or even slightly exceeding it isn't enough. Which is the issue that this film ultimately had when I was looking at it. It was more of a lofty standards rather than the film actually being worse than any in the top 5. For the top 5 itself, starting with number 5, and in my opinion where this particular series should have ended. That is The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, released in 2006. A rating of 93.3 out of 100. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would I say that this is where the Fast and the Furious series should have ended? Wouldn't have they needed to continue it a little more, as this was only the third film? Chronologically, it is actually towards the end of the Fast and the Furious timeline. Plus, most of the other films, not all of them, although all of them do sort of fall off a cliff after this, are just aggressively mediocre at best, with sort of the action sequences being mundane and oversaturated to the point where it's like, we've already seen it before, so why would we need to see it again when there's only so much that you can do that makes it original and unique and actually engaging? This film has it all for the series. This film is what ties the series into a nice little ball and wraps up everything positive about the series. The story keeps in line with what they had done with the series and was fantastically executed. Actually, I would say perfectly executed in the vacuum of the series itself. And then you also have the alpha elements. You have the casting being ideal, which it was for the rest of the series as well, and for the movies beforehand, which is one thing I will give the series props for. They got the casting absolutely right. However, here it really shows. It shows that everything was ideal. This was the series at its absolute peak, at its absolute optimum performance. And that's what you want from a movie. You want a movie that is picking its optimal parts and giving it to you to immerse you within it and actually keep you entertained for the entire duration. Something that the other films in the series lacked, in my opinion, which is why they fell off and really didn't get higher than like a 78 in my opinion, whereas this film got a 93, as you see above. Now, this is very much interchangeable with The Dark Knight Rises, as I briefly touched on, but I feel like this film, for what it did for the series, and how I feel like this is where the series should have ended, whilst I didn't quite get that with The Dark Knight, I still feel like The Dark Knight Rises, it could have been a fourth film. However, it was billed as a trilogy and they wanted to stay true to that, whereas this film was just billed as being the third film in a series, and you knew there were other films coming. However, there probably shouldn't have been, as I've explained it. How this film did everything so perfect that the standard that it set for was going to be nigh on impossible for the other films to follow. That is why it is here at number 5 on my list. It's because of the standard it set, plus on how it tied everything up into a nice little ball and optimized what the series was meant to be about. At least from a personal standpoint, that is what it did for me. And again, I feel like if the series had have ended here, I would have had a much more positive opinion on it, rather than the somewhat soured opinion I do have on the series due to the later film. Number 4 on my list, and my favorite Star Wars film of all time, is Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, released in 1980. 94.6 out of 100 rating from me. Now this, just like the Fast and the Furious series, although I don't feel like this should have ended the Star Wars series, was big Star Wars. This had everything that was good about the Star Wars series wrapped up into one singular movie. Unlike the Disney movies, which have been a victim of oversaturation, which I will talk about in a different video, and sort of give you the concept of what oversaturation of content means and how it can sour tastes on films even when you actually like the series that it was immersed within, which is the same for me with that, like previously the Fast and the Furious series and now the Star Wars series. Yes, I am a Star Wars nerd. I absolutely love Star Wars. And I feel like Darth Vader is one of the better constructed villains of all time, especially with his connection to Luke and how he is actually Luke's father. The Empire Strikes Back is something that really gets you immersed from beginning to end. The casting was perfect. Leia was at her peak in this. Luke and Anakin and all that were ideally presented. And you already knew what you were going to expect going into the series due to the first 4 films. However, this just lifts them a bar above. This takes the films and makes them into what I would call a historic franchise like they are today. Yes, the films were already well known. Yes, they were already well received by the general populace. However, here is where you really realize this was their peak. This was going to be the best franchise of all time. In my opinion, at least, when it comes to the movie industry, it is the best franchise of all time. And George Lucas wanted to present that as such. This was sort of the coming out party of Star Wars, if you want to put it that way. That's all I really want to say about this, and that's all I really need to say. Yes, this was the coming out party. Yes, everything was done to its optimum, to its peak in this particular series. And if there's one Star Wars film that I would recommend everybody watch, it is this one right here. Number 3, and a film that many would argue is one of the greatest of all time, is Citizen Kane, released in 1941, and a film that has aged like a fine wine. A rating of 95.3 out of 100, and a film that could have easily broached the top 2 if it just had a couple of more elements to it. It has one of the best stories of all time. Orson Welles is a fantastic actor. In fact, I would argue he's probably one of the more underrated actors when you look back in the context of history. And just like this film, it's aged like a fine wine when it comes to his sort of acting and the appreciation that people have had for him. Because people may not know this, but this film actually wasn't well received when it was released, surprisingly. It seemed like a film that was ahead of its time with the whole story and cinematic elements. And as you go back and watch it now with the eyes that we have today, you actually can appreciate and realize just how great this film was and just how well presented it was. It was never meant to be an action film. It was never meant to sort of be one of those films that you would go and popcorn it with. It was never meant to do that. It was always meant to engage you and indulge you within the story of the Kane in this story and his dying moments. And sort of the whole thing about the candle and the words and the way they conveyed the story was the main elements that I wanted to look at in it. And I feel like they actually convey the story perfectly. I feel like they ideally give you what you wanted. They go in there knowing that they want the audience to think. They want the audience to engage their brains within it and actually see it as more of an experience from a storytelling standpoint, almost like a book that has been projected onto the screen in front of them. And that is exactly what the movie does. And in my opinion, it actually does it really damn well. Now, why isn't it top 2 in my opinion? Simply because I feel like that whole story element doesn't really have the oomph factor, and I know that is again incredibly subjective. And the story itself is engaging and carries the film, which it should. But I feel like that when you're looking at a film from a standpoint of whether or not it stands in your memory, which this film does, you want that sort of oomph factor. And number 3 is perfectly fine for it, in my opinion. It is my 3rd favorite film of all time. However, as I said, it has a very strong case for being the more objectively oriented greatest film or best produced film of all. I'm Batman. Sorry for that poorly done impersonation. I can usually do them a lot better, but my throat isn't 100% clear right now. But yes, remember when I said spoiler alert when it came to The Dark Knight Rises? That is because The Dark Knight itself, which was released in 2008, is my 2nd favorite film of all time, a rating of 97.4. Now this was the perfect encapsulation of what Batman was all about. Let me try that again. I'm Batman. There we go. That's a little bit better at least. Perfectly done film. Again, Christian Bale was the perfect Batman. Heath Ledger was the perfect Joker. And this told the Batman and Joker story perfectly. Now, if you guys don't actually know, my favorite sort of character in the DC universe is Harley Quinn. I've always loved that sort of multi-layered, sort of sociopathic tendencies, but also having a more softer side and nuances to her, which is something that Batman has. So Harley Quinn to me is sort of the villainous female Batman, if you want to call it that. The Dark Knight is the peak of Batman film. No, in fact, it is the peak of comic book films in general. Now, it isn't number one on my favorite list simply because of one single element, which I'll discuss when we get to the number one itself. But on another day, it could very well be. It is, again, probably a better film than what I do have at number one, and in my opinion, along with Citizen Kane, could easily go down as one of the most transcendent and greatest films of all time, which is a little more objectively based in the subjective nature of this list. However, it just has to settle for number two on an all-time favorite list, which is done with subjectivity being the primary and only focus. But let's talk a little more about the film. Perfect casting, perfect story, gets you to think, gets you to actually engage with it from start to finish, and really draws you in and makes you feel the story. It makes you feel like you're actually a part of it. And just like Citizen Kane, it feels more like a book that is being projected onto a screen rather than an actual sort of what you would traditionally describe as being the aim of a movie. The cinematics are perfect. The action sequences, the fight sequences are done with aplomb. They're done absolutely ideally. And everything just ties itself into a... And here we are, the number one film of all time with a 97.7 rating out of 100 from me is The Matrix Reloaded, released in 2003. Rather, it's my number one favorite film of all time. And still to this day, a film that I have watched nearly 150 times. I'm a big sucker for science fiction-oriented films, as you may have seen from some of the films on this list and the orientation of them. But this encapsulates it perfectly, in my opinion. Keanu Reeves is a fantastic actor, and someone that I've always felt like massively underrated when you actually look at sort of your top 10, top 15 greatest actors of all time. I don't see many people looking at him in that light, which I do. I actually have him as like number 4 on my greatest actors of all time list. And yes, there are some roles that he hasn't been fit for, but his role in this film, he is absolutely perfect for. It's Neo. Lawrence Fishburne is also a perfect fit for the role of Morpheus, who, by the way, is my favorite antagonist of all time as well. I've always loved his design. I've always loved the nuances behind him. And I did say this was more of a sci-fi film, which is not technically considered as it is technically fantasy/mystery, which is another genre that I actually really do like and allows me to engage and sort of escape from reality by immersing myself within those sort of films. So you'll notice that a lot of those films will always rate higher than I did. Now, for full disclosure, this is the second film in a trilogy, which if you haven't noticed, again, second films in trilogies, which was the same with The Dark Knight, will always, to me, be sort of that encapsulation of everything that was right with the first film, and whilst minimizing what was wrong with it, whilst also giving the third film of the trilogy a base to feed off. Now, in this case, it did set the bar extremely high for the third film, and the third film did not quite live up to it. However, it was still a solid film. But this, again, was just the absolute perfection. This was it at its optimum. This was at its peak. And this gave you everything that you loved about The Matrix and tied it all up into a neat little ball. Which, again, is my favorite phrase when describing these sort of things. And as I said, sort of the ending where you see the one survivor, which is the possessed Bane, to borrow from The Dark Knight or the Batman series, and really gives you sort of that interest and hooks you in and makes you want to watch the third movie from the get-go and see where they actually follow up with it. which I feel like the middle movie of the trilogy should always be doing. Anyways, that has been my top 10 list. Anyways, that has been my top 10 favorite movies list. Feel free to leave your list or any opinions that you have on mine, and let's start a discussion in the comments. A new video will be coming out in the next couple of days or whenever I have time, which will probably be within the next 2 to 3 days. No guarantees at this moment, but feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video or if you want more content from me. But anyway, I am going to let you all go for now, and I'll see you when we come back with the next video, which will be more of a regular commentary / discussion video that I like to do on this channel. But for now, remember, once again, like, comment, subscribe if you desire to, and bye, people. I'll see you next time.